Hey there, I want to share a couple more thoughts on Daniel that I have. I thought they were really neat. Um, just as I've been going through Daniel, I've been thinking of the title "Living for God in a Pagan World" or a pagan society. And like Daniel and his friends, they were surrounded by a whole bunch of people who did not fear God, who worshiped many other gods and idols. And how do we, as Christians today, stay focused on God? How do we stay on the path following God? Um, what are some things we can learn from Daniel as he has been going through his life and just been learning to really rely and trust on God? Um, I think here in Daniel chapter 5, we get a little bit of insight into Daniel and into some of the things that he has learned. So, this is a story of Belshazzar, who is he's probably a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar in history. He wasn't the direct, even though the queen calls Nebuchadnezzar his father. That sometimes was done, even though, like, it's even in the kings of Israel, they always said your father David, but it could have been like way down the line too. So in history, and you can look that up yourself. I'm not going to go into that too deep, but this story actually happened about 23 years after the death of King Nebuchadnezzar, and so I mean that explains also why that this king didn't really know of Daniel at all, because if he came right after Nebuchadnezzar, and actually this king was also some sources suggest that he was kind of a fill-in, like for his father, or like he was king, but his father was gone somewhere, and there's just some different things, but nonetheless, he was king at this time. Um, so we see this story where they have this party for the nobles and the officials and stuff, and he calls for the temple utensils that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar to be brought in so that they can use those in their drunken feast, basically. And this hand appears and writes something on the wall. And I don't want to focus on that part of the story. The story I want to focus on is where Daniel actually comes into play. So the queen mother, he's all shaken up, and the queen mother comes in and said, there was a man who was interpreting for your father. He was interpreting dreams, and the spirit of the gods was in him. And she gives this account of Daniel, the way she saw it. And in verse 17 of Daniel 5, and I want to start there. It says, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, 'Let your gifts be to yourself, and give your reward to another.' Because the king had offered whoever was able to interpret this writing a golden chain, and to be third in position in his whole kingdom." But we see here what Daniel thinks of that. And I think one of the things that, as what we need to learn as Christians in our society, when we are surrounded by a whole bunch of people who do not love the Lord, one of the things is that Daniel learned contentment in the Lord. He was completely content in the Lord. You notice he did not need the king's gifts. He said, "Let your gifts be to yourself, and give your rewards to another." He did not care about position, fame. He was completely content. And the Lord has provided for him thus far and will continue to provide. And he just didn't see a need to even go into there would have been so much jealousy between all these other guys, and like he just didn't need it because he was content in the Lord. Um, the second thing that I want to point out here is he said, "Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known the meaning of this thing to him. As for you, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. He killed whom he desired, and whom he desired he kept alive, and whom he desired he exalted, and whom he desired he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit grew hard to act proudly, he was cast down from the throne of his kingdom, and his majesty was taken away from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like that of the beasts of, and his abode was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God is ruling in the kingdom of men, and that he appoints over it whomever he wills." I think the second thing we learn, Daniel did not have to say any of this, but Daniel, I believe, felt compelled to. And what the second thing I want to point out, that Daniel has learned how to live a godly life in a godless society, and then that goes for us too, is that Daniel has a godly perspective. He has godly wisdom, and that was given to him, I believe, for his obedience in the beginning. We saw that in chapter 1. The Lord, it says the Lord gave him a wisdom and understanding and interpretations of dreams and visions. And so Daniel had a godly perspective and godly wisdom. So he was able to look at events and things, and just was able to draw conclusions based on the wisdom that God gave him. He didn't have to say any of this, but he is making the meaning of this writing so much more clear, and why this writing was made. Like, this background gives it more sense. So, verse 22, and he says, "And you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not bowed your heart, though you knew all this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine with them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see nor hear and do not know. And you have not glorified the God in whose hand is your life breath and all your ways." So the third thing that Daniel, that we can learn when we live in this godless society, is that obedience to God in everything creates complete honesty. So, like, he was completely obedient. He did not, listen to what he says. He basically tells him that the gods that they worship, all of their gods, are deaf. They don't hear. They're just wood, stone, gold, silver. They don't hear. They don't know. They're not gods at all. And that takes a lot of guts, telling the king and all these nobles who would worship these gods as their true gods, to tell them exactly that the opposite, that these gods are nothing. They are just exactly what they are: stone, wood, silver, and they are nothing more than that. He was completely obedient to the Lord. He did not care what others around him thought. What mattered to him was that he was obedient to God. And I think that in today's world, in today's society, we're getting to a place where we are going to have to be either obedient to God or not. I mean, this is what he says here in verse 23. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. Um, that's the other thing, you know, like I would rather be for God than against God. I would rather die for God than to live against Him, you know. And so I think Daniel, I mean, when you look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that would have encouraged his resolve even more to be obedient, even in the face of death. I mean, he saw that through his friends and how God, in that instance, rescued them from the fire. But Daniel was completely obedient. So he was content in everything. He had a godly wisdom. And here he was obedient to God, which actually gave him a complete, just to be completely honest, he didn't hide things from the king. It's funny because when you look at the first dream he interprets from Nebuchadnezzar, he interprets the dream, but he doesn't put in that all his gods are false. And, you know, but I believe he has grown a lot too. And this time he's much older. He's probably about 80 years old here. And, you know, he just knows that obedience is what he needs to do. And that's what he does. And so he is such an awesome example for us to follow. And, you know, and I think it is loving of him to have said this to him, to the king, because he could have just interpreted, said, you know, but he actually gives him a reason why. And I mean, maybe this king could have changed it. I know he didn't, but maybe he could have repented, but he didn't. And so the king actually ends up dying. But anyway, I found that interesting. The last thing I want to point out is to verse 20, where it talks about but when his heart, talking about Nebuchadnezzar now, just as kind of a side note, was lifted up, and his spirit grew hard. You know, one of the things in a lot of the Disney movies, and not even Disney, many of the movies that you watch today has a message in it to follow your heart. You know, to listen to your heart, to trust the feelings of your heart, and this is what it leads to right here. It says, when his heart was lifted up, when he became prideful, and his spirit grew hard. You know, our spirits grow hard when we actually follow our heart. We need, God says in Jeremiah, the heart is deceitfully wicked above all, and who it is incurable. Who can know it? This is what we're to do with our hearts. Verse 22. It says, he says to Belshazzar, you have not bowed your heart, though you knew all of this. We need to bow our hearts to the Lord. We need to actually realize that our hearts are deceitfully wicked. We need to surrender ourselves to Him, because if we listen to our heart is deceptive and will deceive us and will actually make us proud. But when we actually see that our hearts are wicked and we give them over to the Lord, He can transform them. He can take an incurable heart and completely miraculously transform it. And so, yeah, that's just kind of a side note. I thought that was really neat. Anyways, this is getting kind of long, but I love you all. Talk to you later.